Thank you for inviting me to address you on these very important topics. I wish I could be there uh, in person to share my views. As you all know, we are in the midst of what some have called polycrises: a climate crisis, an inequality crisis, a crisis of trust in our institutions, a democratic crisis. There's polarization within and between countries. Let me say up front, I believe very strongly in democracy, market economies, but a market economy that works for all the citizens, and that means a market economy in which government, non-governmental institutions, a whole rich ecology of institutions plays an important role. I've referred to this kind of broader sense of capitalism as progressive capitalism, very different from the kind of neoliberal capitalism that has dominated for the last 40 years. I also believe that if we are to sustain our democracies, we must rebuild the trust that has been lost. All the studies, all the surveys show that, in fact, there's been a loss of trust in our major institutions. But to rebuild trust, I believe we need to reduce the inequalities which have grown so markedly over the last 25 years, and especially over the last 3 years. Moreover, we have to do all of this in the context of a world facing planetary boundaries. I think it's not fully appreciated the way we pushed against our planetary boundaries in just the last 70 years during my own lifetime. Global GDP in the last 7 years has increased 15-fold, while the global population has increased 3-fold. What we could do in 1950, we cannot do today. Climate change is an existential crisis, but it's not the only critical environmental vulnerability. Addressing these climate change and other environmental issues will require global cooperation. And this is where the current polarization is so evident is not very helpful. I think it's critical that we frame our relationships based on healthy and strong competition. But competition in some areas does not preclude cooperation in other areas. And what we obviously need is cooperation in global health issues like pandemic, and cooperation in the existential issue of the day, climate change. This ability to compete in some areas and cooperate in others is going to be the critical geopolitical challenge of the coming decades. Of course, it should be in the interest of all that these crises be addressed, and quickly. But economics has taught us about what is called the free rider problem. Everybody wants others to do the heavy lifting. They want others to cut back strongly in their emissions. They agree something should be done, but wouldn't it be better if others did it? This mentality, I think, is doubly wrong. First, if everyone thinks that way, then we are doomed, and we should know that. But there's another reason this way of thinking, I think, is wrong. I think that growth and strong climate action can be complementary. That is to say, countries that take stronger climate action may actually find that it is better for their economy. Laura Stern and I have recently written a paper explaining why that is so. Let me just give you one aspect of the nature of this complementarity. Taking strong climate action early gives one an advantage because of what economists refer to as learning by doing. When one does something, when one goes to renewables as opposed to fossil fuels, there's a lot of learning to be done. And it's quite striking how successful we've been in bringing down the cost of renewables in just a short span of time with remarkably little government impetus, come down something like 75 to 90%. More generally, taking this and other actions, renewables, green buildings, green transportation systems, puts one further ahead in this learning process. Korea learned this lesson decades ago when it began its development process after the Korean War. It leapfrogged and started, for instance, producing chips. It went down the learning curve, and it's now very hard for others to compete. It became a leading producer in many other areas, and now, my understanding, is trying to do the same in green hydrogen. Ideally, one might imagine governments putting into place regulations and other policies addressing all these crises. For instance, we could imagine having a carbon price, strong climate regulations, investments, and other policies to protect the environment. We could imagine strong competition laws, minimum wages, labor laws strengthening unions and workers' bargaining power to combat the inequality crisis. We could imagine strong laws against fraud and other consumer protection legislation, and transparency laws and laws governing mis- and disinformation to help restore trust. But we're far from that ideal. And we all know some of the reasons why governments haven't been able to achieve this. The political process in democracies is complicated, and there are vested interests that don't want action in these areas. Fossil fuel companies that don't want to move faster towards the ecological transition. Because we don't have this perfect governmental structure, firms and households have to do their part to address these crises. They have to think of the regulations as the bare minimum of what they should do. Firms that pay the minimum wages should ask, is that a livable wage? What would life be living with that wage? Firms that are emitting greenhouse gases, but still within the law, need to ask, how do they feel about themselves as they contribute to a planetary disaster? As shareholders, we should want our money going to firms that act, to put it simply, in the right way, in a moral way. But we can't ascertain that without firms disclosing what they are doing. Disclosure is the sine qua non. That's where ESG comes in, environmental, social, and governing standards that all firms should pursue. Corporations are an important part of the market economy's institutional framework. And thus, if there is not good governance of corporations with transparency, where all corporations serve all stakeholders, there won't be trust in market economies, and there won't be trust in our democracy. Milton Friedman, you might say the high priest of the neoliberal capitalism that prevailed from the middle of the last century until recently, he and other conservatives led the world down, I think, a destructive path, claiming that firms should only pay attention to shareholders, what was called shareholder value maximization. They should ignore the environment, workers, the communities in which they work. All they needed to do was do what they had to do to stay out of prison, to stay within the law. They should do the bare minimum that the law required. Whatever they can get away with, whatever is legal, that increases the value of shares should be done. Let me make it clear, there were actually very weak intellectual underpinnings for Friedman's assertion. He wanted to say that if firms maximized shareholder value, societal well-being would be maximized. A little bit along the lines of a 20th century reinterpretation of Adam Smith. But Adam Smith had made it very clear that markets on their own do not lead to societal well-being. He described the pursuit of self-interest as an important force, but he also explained that whenever firms could get together, they would collude to raise prices, to drive down wages. He argued that there needed to be strong regulations in many areas. And he thought there ought to, individuals and companies ought to go beyond what was required. Sandy Grossman and I wrote a series of papers showing that shareholder value maximization did not lead to societal well-being. We were actually writing these papers at the same time that Milton Friedman was arguing for shareholder value maximization. We published our articles in the Quarterly Journal of Economics and the Journal of Finance, peer-reviewed journals. And the arguments that we put forward 50 years later still stand, haven't been undermined. But Milton Friedman published his ideas in the New York Times Magazine. He was a great rhetorician, great in his rhetoric, and his ideas had an enormous amount of influence. In fact, he went so far as to argue, in effect, that not to maximize shareholder value was immoral. He won the day, but our society has paid a high price. Now, 50 years later, we've seen the error of this particular approach. Even in the United States, the last bastion of shareholder capitalism, the idea has been beginning to be questioned, and even in the business roundtable that brings together our largest firms. Let me spend a few minutes talking about each of the elements of ESG. And I begin with the G, the last part, with governance, because only with good governance can the other objectives be achieved. S stands for social, and this refers to the broader social obligations that corporations have, including to treating workers decently, not exploiting them, even as possible to do so to enhance profits. I think this is really important if we are to restore confidence in our democratic market economies. Finally, and importantly, E is for the environment, on which I've already dwelled. I want to return to the point that as citizens, we want to invest our money in firms that have a good ESG record. But that means there must be disclosure. It must be required and standardized. Efforts to do this are now underway in the United States. Accounting frameworks are inherently imperfect, but there are simple indicators that could be employed that would provide a good picture of how well firms are doing in achieving these broader ESG goals. We should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We know that our standard accounting frameworks and conventional part and profits are imperfect and can and are gained. This will be true of the ESG metrics as well. But hopefully, the combination of a free press and diligent analysts will uncover instances of gross deviations between the truth and what is reported in the metrics. I return to the beginning of my talk and the themes of this conference. The multiple crises we face can only be addressed if all of us in all of our countries do our part. ESG is an important instrument to facilitate corporations doing their part to make a sustainable and equitable future. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to the proceedings of the conference.